Okay, hello guys, and welcome to our presentation. We will be presenting the racial wealth gap and home ownership disparities by Alyssa Collins, Katie Collins, Shakita Cleveland, and Nakima Davis. So defining the racial wealth gap, it's the racial wealth gap isn't just about income. It's about assets, generational wealth, and in the U.S., the number one ways families build wealth is through home ownership. But for Black and Latino households, the access to that wealth building has always been limited. Here's what the gap looks like in numbers. As of 2022, 75% of white households own homes compared to 45% of Black households and 48% of Hispanic households. These percentages haven't changed much in the past 50 years, which tells us that it's more than just financial literacy and personal budgeting. There is an issue with access and systems and also historical exclusion. We can trace a lot of today's gap back to specific historical policies. Redlining in the 1930s labeled Black neighborhoods as risky investments. Then also after World War II, the GI Bill was supposed to help returning veterans, but in practice, Black veterans were often denied those access to those benefits. These policies prevented Black families from building home equity. Some of the structural barriers today that exist is that Black neighborhoods are often appraised 20 to 23% lower than similar homes in white neighborhoods. Um, that means there's billions of dollars lost in wealth for Black families. Mortgage lending is another area where disparities are still huge. Black and Latino borrowers are more likely to be denied loans or pushed into more expensive ones. And our credit system relies on models that disadvantage people who don't have access to traditional financial tools. These are all examples of structural inequalities.
Okay, so in this section, I want to share a brief overview of some of the additional literature that really deepens our understanding of the racial wealth gap and homeownership disparities. Um, in the fourth article down, Troy and his colleagues at the Urban Institute looked at the black and white home ownership gap across local markets. They found that the gap isn't the same everywhere. So local policies, market conditions, and histories all play a role. This means when we're looking at the racial wealth gap, we can't take a one size fits all approach when thinking about solutions. We need strategies that address the specific barriers each community has. Darity and his team make a very important point about the root cause of the wealth gap. They argue that it's not just individual choices like saving more or getting a better education, but instead that it's structural racism that drives these disparities. Their work really challenges us to think beyond blaming individuals and focus on changing the systems and policies that created these inequities. Oliver and Shapiro's book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, is critical for understanding historical roots of the problem. They show how policies like redlining deny Black families the opportunity to build and pass on wealth, and the effects that those policies just don't go away. They continue to shape the wealth gap. Pager and Shepard also add to this understanding by showing that discrimination in housing, lending, and credit markets is not just a thing of the past. Their review of this evidence makes it clear that these practices still happen today, creating real barriers for families trying to buy homes and build wealth. Finally, Shapiro's toxic inequality explains how these disparities compound over generations. When families are shut out of homeownership, it limits their ability to build and transfer wealth to the next generation. This isn't just a static gap, it's one that grows over time if we don't address it. Altogether, these sources really reinforce that the racial wealth gap tied to homeownership is a systemic problem. It's not about an individual's failure. It's about historic and ongoing policy choices. Addressing it requires us to think about structural, community level, and policy driven solutions.
Efforts to address racial wealth and homeownership disparities have been ongoing for decades, but many fall short of addressing the root causes. A foundational policy was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which aimed to outlaw racial discrimination in housing. This was followed by the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, which encouraged banks to lend in low-income neighborhoods and prevent redlining. More recently, Housing and Urban Development funded housing counseling services and various down payment assistance programs that have attempted to support first-time home buyers, particularly those in low incomes. However, despite these efforts, major disparities persist. One major critique is that these policies often lack enforcement teeth, meaning discrimination still quietly thrives in real estate, mortgage lending, and appraisals. Additionally, many of these programs are race neutral. They're designed to assist all low-income people rather than directly confronting the specific barriers that the Black and Brown families face as a result of historical redlining and wealth extraction. Some policy proposals, like Senator Cory Booker's baby bonds idea, attempt to reduce the racial gap by providing children with trust accounts that end up growing over time. And the Biden administration proposed $25,000 for a first-time home buyer grant to reduce upfront housing costs. But again, unless these policies explicitly account for the historical and ongoing racial inequities, they risk being too broad to make a real change. Ultimately, these attempts reflect progress, but without directly addressing structural racism in wealth building systems, they often fail to close the gap.
So critical race theory helps us to see that racism isn't just about individual actions. It's built into housing policies and systems. Practices like redlining and biased lending have systematically kept communities of color from owning homes. CRT pushes us to look beyond quick fixes and focus on deep structural change. It also reminds us to center the voices of those most affected. Social workers can use this theory to advocate for fair housing laws and to challenge systems that maintain racial inequalities. CRT helps us to see that many housing policies labeled as neutral actually maintain white wealth and privilege. These systems keep communities of colors at a disadvantage by limiting access to mortgages, affordable housing, and investment in their neighborhoods. Understanding this systemic racism is essential because it means solutions must be structural and not just about individual behaviors or choices. So some of the proposed solutions Solutions that are grounded in CRT focuses on reforming discriminatory lending and appraisal processes and investing in communities historically excluded from wealth building. Down payment assistance and fair housing enforcements are examples of policy tools that can help dismantle these barriers. In social work practice, CRT guides us to advocate for systemic reforms, center the voices of those affected, and build partnership with marginalized communities. These approaches move beyond treating symptoms to address root causes of inequality. So the overall goal is for us to create equitable community-centered solutions that confront systemic racism and reflect the lived realities of marginalized populations. Social workers and advocates must lead with intention, accountability, and commitment to lasting structural change. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.